Picture two mothers, same age, roughly, both intentional parents, both have done the reading and both understand the theory about what's happening when a child has a meltdown. The same moment arrives for both of them, 6:30 on a Tuesday. The child doesn't want to stop doing what they're doing to come for dinner, and the feeling starts to build. The first mother erupts. Something in her ignites faster than she can think, louder than she intended. She can hear herself, which somehow makes it worse. Afterwards, there's the apology, the repair, and the lying awake. The second mother goes somewhere entirely different. She doesn't erupt, she goes cold. The warmth in her face disappears. She says the correct words in a voice her child doesn't quite recognize. She's there physically and completely absent in every other way. Afterwards, she can barely remember what happened. Just a kind of blankness where the moment should be. Two mothers, same scenario, opposite reactions. But it's the same wound. That's what today's about. Welcome back to The Family Architect. I'm Philippa Scott. This is episode 35, and we're continuing the attachment trauma series we started last week. Last week, I introduced the central idea that the reactions you can't stop, the patterns you can't explain, the moments where you become someone you swore you'd never be, these are not character failures. They're attachment wounds wired into your nervous system in childhood, running a protective program that your little girl built when she needed it and never got to put down. Today we go deeper because the wound doesn't look the same in every person. And one of the most confusing things for parents who are trying to understand their own reactivity is that the person next to them, maybe a partner, maybe a friend, maybe a sibling who grew up in the same house, seems to have a completely different passion. Same origin, different expression. And understanding why that happens changes everything about how you recognize the wound in yourself. Here's the thing about attachment wounds that I want you to really sit with. The wound does not produce a single response. It produces the response that worked. The response your nervous system learned in the specific environment you grew up in would best maintain the attachment you needed to survive. If you grew up in a house where intensity got a response, where escalating emotions was the thing that made the adults pay attention, or where your needs only got met when you made them impossible to ignore, your nervous system may have learned to escalate, to get loud, to push through, because that's what worked. If you grew up in a house where your emotions made things worse, where your crying made an adult more dysregulated, or your needs felt dangerous to have, maybe where the safer strategy was to shrink into yourself and take up as little emotional space as possible, your nervous system may have learned to disappear, to go quiet, maybe to shut down, because that's what kept you safe. If you grew up in a house where the emotional weather was unpredictable, where you couldn't tell from one moment to the next whether expressing yourself would be met with warmth or rage or silence, your nervous system may have learned to monitor, to stay in a state of constant low-level readiness, scanning the room, adjusting your behavior to manage the adult's state, never quite relaxing because you could never quite predict what was coming. Those are not personality flaws. They are protection strategies. And they are entirely logical given the environments that shaped them. The problem is that 30 years later, the child who learned to escalate is now a parent. And when her own child's big feelings arrive, the protection program fires in the direction it was built. Escalation. Not because she wants to, because that's what the wiring does. The child who learned to disappear is now a parent too. And when the moment gets hard, the same thing happens. The wiring fires. The walls go up. The warmth leaves the room. Same wound underneath. Different direction based on what survival required. Now, let me tell you some of the ways this shows up for parents whose wiring fires outwards. So, First is the parent who, when they listen back to themselves in the hard moment, hears something that stops them cold, not their own voice, someone else's, maybe their mother's or their father's. The exact tone, the exact words, the exact quality of coldness or heat that they grew up on the receiving end of and swore, genuinely, completely swore they would never become. This is the parent running a generational program, and not because they chose it, but because their nervous system was wired into it during the years when their parents' emotional patterns were the entire emotional climate they lived inside. The program isn't something they learned intellectually. It was downloaded into the body, into the nervous system, into the reflexes that fire before the mind has time to intervene. Their mother's survival program is still running. And every time the conditions are right, exhaustion, sensory overload, child's emotional intensity, it runs automatically. This is the parent who says, sound exactly like her, and I can't stop it, even when I hear it happening. The second type is the parent whose nervous system is simply faster than their intention. Their window of tolerance is narrowing. Their body is in a state of low-grade activation most of the time. And it's not dramatically, just a baseline of readiness, of vigilance, of the system sitting closer to the edge than it should. And sometimes we call that hypervigilance, and sometimes it narrows itself down into medical hypervigilance or health and those sorts of things. But when the trigger arrives, and it doesn't have to be a big trigger, it can be tiny, it can be nothing. They're already so close to the edge that the reaction fires before they've registered what's happening. And the jaw clenches, the voice changes, the words are out before the thought is formed. They already know what to do. They know the theory, they know the script, they've practiced it in calm moments. And at 7:43 p.m., when their child won't get in the bath and everything that happened today is still sitting in their body, the knowing is completely inaccessible because the body's taken over. Their nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is running a survival program that was built to protect them from a threat that is no longer present. It's just still wired for that threat. And wiring doesn't update on its own. The third is a parent who wouldn't describe herself as reactive in the explosive sense. She doesn't yell exactly, but there's a threshold. And when it's crossed, something in her becomes unavailable. The skin that's been touched all day, the need that has been directed at her all day, the noise, the volume, the emotional weather of the household, it reaches a point where her entire system says no more. I cannot take in anything else. And she withdraws, or she snaps, or she says something short and cutting and closes the door and immediately feels ashamed of it. This is not tiredness from today. This is tiredness from everything the body is still carrying. Old sensation that never got processed. A nervous system that learned somewhere in its early formation that being needed meant being depleted, and that there was nobody coming to refill the tank. She's not touched out from the afternoon. She's touched out from a childhood's worth of unmet needs that have been sitting in her body ever since. Now, let me describe the other direction. The parent who doesn't erupt, who goes somewhere else entirely. This is the parent whose child is crying and something in them shuts down instead of firing up. The warmth leaves their face. They become correct but absent. They say the right things in a voice that doesn't quite sound like them. They handle the situation competently, and their child can feel, even though they can't articulate, that the person they need is not quite there. The shutdown is not a choice. It's the oldest protection available to the nervous system. A way of leaving a situation without physically leaving. Emotional disappearance as self-protection. This pattern tends to develop in environments where emotional expression was genuinely dangerous, where the child's feelings made things worse, where needing comfort produced more chaos. Maybe where the safest thing to do was learn not to need, not to feel, not to take up emotional space. The shut down child grew up, and now when her own child's needs press against her, especially the loud, messy, inconveniently timed needs that children specialize in, the old program fires. Disappear, go flat, wait for it to be over. This parent often doesn't get identified as reactive. She isn't yelling and she isn't in the obvious category of parent who needs to work on their reactivity. But her child's nervous system is reading her absence. And the impact of a parent who disappears is its own wound. The shutdown is not a personality trait. It is a protection program and it can be resolved. And then there's a third pattern, the parent who neither erupts nor disappears cleanly, who does something in between, something that might look smaller from the outside, but is exhausting to live inside. She reacts, not always dramatically, sometimes just a sharpness in the voice, a withdrawal of warmth, a moment where she's not quite herself. And then immediately, sometimes before the moment is even over, the shame arrives. Heavy, consuming, recycling shame. Shame that doesn't resolve into change, just loops back into the beginning and runs again. React, shame, apologize, try harder. React, shame, apologize, try harder. The shame itself becomes the problem because shame is not just a feeling, it's a nervous system state. And a nervous system caught in a shame loop is not a nervous system with capacity for anything else. Not the presence her child needs, and not the regulation she's trying to build, and certainly not the change she's working toward. This pattern often develops in environments where the child was responsible for the adult's emotional state, where she learned that when something went wrong, it was her fault, where she carried the weight of the family's feelings and never got to put it down. The shame isn't new, it's ancient. It's been running since the first time she felt responsible for something that was never hers to be responsible for. The shame loop is not a character flaw, it's a nervous system pattern, and like all nervous system patterns, it can be unwired. There's one more pattern I want to name because it's the one that gets missed almost entirely in parenting conversations. And for women who've experienced it, the missing of it has been profound. Some mothers carry a wound that predates their child's personality, predates the bedtime battles and the toddler tantrums and the adolescent confrontation. It begins at birth. Birth is one of the most intense physiological and psychological events a human body will ever experience. And for many women, that experience, the loss of control, the fear, the pain, the moment where something happened that felt wrong or frightening or violating, doesn't end when the baby arrives safely. It ends in the body. It stays in the body, encoded in the nervous system, unprocessed because there was a baby to care for and nobody was asking how the mother was. And then the child grows. And something in that child, their emotional intensity, their need, the specific quality of their demands, activates something the mother doesn't have words for because it's not a thought, it's a body memory. The body that was in that room is still in that room in some sense, still carrying what it experienced there. This is not a metaphor, this is physiology. Unprocessed trauma lives in the nervous system as active sensation, not as stored memory, which is why a birth experience from 4 years ago, 14 years ago, or even 40 years ago can fire with the same intensity as something that happened yesterday. If you're a mother who finds herself reacting to your child with a quality of fear or overwhelm or disconnection that doesn't quite map into what's actually happening in front of you, this may be worth sitting with. The wound may have started earlier than you thought. 5 patterns, 5 different expressions, and underneath all of them, the same thing. A little girl who needs to stay connected to the people she depended on, who built a protection program to do that, who did the only thing available to her in the environment she was given. She's still running that program in your body, in your nervous system, in the reflexes that fire before you have time to choose. And here's what I want you to hold from today's episode. The direction your wound goes, whether you erupt or disappear or loop or shut down, is not a measure of how damaged you are or how hard you've tried or how capable you are of changing. It is simply the direction your nervous system learned to go in the specific environment that shaped it to keep the attachment safe. It makes complete sense. Every bit of it makes complete sense. And it can be resolved, not just managed, not coped with, resolved at the level of the nervous system where the wound actually lives. The Wired quiz is in the show notes. It'll take you a few minutes, but it names the specific pattern running in your nervous system, a particular protection program your little girl built, and what direction it fires. Because the work starts with knowing what you're actually dealing with specifically, not in general, specifically. Next week, we're going deeper into the mechanism. Remember what happens in the body in the moment of activation, why the window between feeling arriving and the reaction firing is so small, and what it actually means to widen that window. Not with scripts, with rewiring. I'll see you there. I'm Philippa Scott. This is The Family Architect.